What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today, I want to talk to you about The Wildstorm, Volume 1, written by Warren Ellis with art by John Davis Hunt. This is the first 6 issues of what I believe is an ongoing reboot of the Wildstorm universe from the 1990s and 2000s. If you are unfamiliar with the Wildstorm universe, in the early 90s, there were, I believe, 6 guys who formed Image Comics, which was this big shared universe of superhero stories, a new universe that they all created, and they each had complete and total creative control over their corner of the Image Comics universe. And Jim Lee, his corner, eventually kind of split off from Image Comics and became the Wildstorm universe. I'm not sure when it officially was called Wildstorm, but eventually Jim Lee kind of brought his creations that he had at Image Comics and brought them under the umbrella of DC Comics. And then eventually, even later, these characters from the Wildstorm universe existed in the DC Comics universe. So that's why you can now find comic books where Grifter from the WildC.A.T.S series is coexisting and on the same page as Deathstroke from the Teen Titans comics. So it's all a little confusing where these characters are from, but this is basically taking all those characters and rebooting them in their own little universe. And it's a little weird that they chose Warren Ellis to head this up, because Warren Ellis is one of the guys who kind of made the Wildstorm universe what it is. In the late 1990s, he was basically given Stormwatch, which was one of the side books from Jim Lee's corner of Image Comics, and said, do whatever you want with Stormwatch. And he did, and then eventually that series ended, and he took the characters that were left from it, and he did The Authority, and that became a huge series. I would even say that's probably what made Warren Ellis so famous in America. He had done some other American comics before, like Doom 2099, but The Authority and Planetary, both at Wildstorm, I think are what really made him huge in American comics. And so it's a little odd that they are getting the guy who created and renovated a lot of the Wildstorm stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s, and asking him to once again reboot all of that in, I believe, 2017. It feels like if you had asked Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, we want you to do the Ultimate Universe. That's kind of what it feels like to me. It's not exactly the same because it's not as big of a stretch of time, but it's still kind of the same premise. So that's a little odd because a lot of this feels a lot like what Warren Ellis was doing in the Wildstorm universe the first time. So I don't really know why whoever it was who came up with this idea, why they said, let's get the guy who created some of these characters and ask him to do it again. But beyond that, does this story work? I'm going to say maybe. This is 6 issues, and I still am having a hard time getting a handle on what's going on here. And that's because it is taking an entire universe of characters and trying to shove it all into one series. You have characters from The Authority / Stormwatch, WildC.A.T.S. I believe there was a series called Wetworks that was in there, and you are shoving all of them into this one series, and there's a lot of characters and a lot of subplots to juggle and try and balance. Basically, this is just basic math. If you have one subplot and one character that you are following through that subplot, you can cover a lot of ground with that subplot. But if you have 2 subplots and 2 separate characters that you're following, both of those stories are going to move at half the speed. If they're both getting equal screen time, they're going to move at half the speed that the one subplot would get if it was by itself. And every time you add a subplot, each one is getting less to do and is moving forward at a slower pace. This has so many subplots and so many characters that it is balancing that it's hard for me to care about what's going on because there's so much stuff that I have to care about. Zealot from the WildC.A.T.S series, she's here and doesn't really do anything. You could completely remove her and it wouldn't really change the plot of what's going on in these 6 issues. She works for some company, either International Operations or this other company, I can't remember what it's called, and she goes around and then kills people and does stuff. I don't really know what she does. I don't know who she works for because there's so much to keep up with here. There are basically 3 gigantic corporations. There's International Operations, and they are bad guys, and then there's this other organization run by Henry Bendix, who is from the Stormwatch series from the late 90s, and he's also a bad guy, I think, although he doesn't really do anything bad here, but I know in the original Wildstorm universe universe, he was a bad guy, and he kind of acts like he's bad here, even though he doesn't technically do anything bad. And then there's this other organization run by Jacob Marlowe. And Jacob Marlowe, I guess, is the closest thing to a good guy that we have in this series. And then he's got people like Grifter working for him, these other two ladies who I don't know what their superhero code names are. That's one thing that's a little frustrating about this, is that if you are not vehemently very familiar with the Wildstorm universe, front and back, if you don't know all of the characters and their superhero names and their civilian identities, this might be a little bit confusing to you. When I saw Zealot, I instantly said, oh, okay, that's Zealot. And then later on, Henry Bendix is calling her by her human name, and I was having trouble remembering who is that. Oh, wait, that's Zealot that he's talking about. Grifter, I know Grifter, but it takes me a minute to remember his real name is Cole Cash. And in this book, they do a whole lot of human naming people. They don't really call a whole lot of people by their superhero names that you are more likely to know, or at least I'm more likely to know, because I don't know the Wildstorm universe as well as other people do, and so whenever they call a character by their civilian name, I kind of have trouble placing them and figuring out, oh, okay, this character is important because he's that character. There's a character in here who runs international operations. His name is Miles Craven. I have no idea if he's from the original Wildstorm universe, if he's a supervillain, if he's a good guy that Warren Ellis turned into a supervillain here. I don't know if he's a brand new creation here. I have no idea. But getting back to how many subplots and how many characters there are to juggle here, you could very easily remove Zealot and remove Henry Bendix from this story, and it basically wouldn't change anything. Now, I wouldn't have a problem with, in the last issue of this book, when Jacob Marlowe is explaining to the engineer, Angie Spica, when he's explaining to her kind of this whole power struggle that's going on between international operations, Jacob Marlowe, and then this third organization. When he's explaining all of that, I wouldn't have a problem with him saying, okay, you got international operations, then you got my group, and then you got this other group. I wouldn't mind him saying all of that and kind of laying down the exposition for a point of view character. I wouldn't mind that. The problem is, we spend much more time with Zealot and Henry Bendix and his organization than what we really need to, especially since those guys don't actually do anything to impact the plot here. If you want them to be part of this world, that's fine, but don't introduce them until they actually have something to do in this story. And in this volume, they don't have anything to do. Maybe they have something to do later on, but right now, they don't have anything to do. In a way, this kind of reminds me of the television show Heroes, which had a whole bunch of characters that you had to keep up with, and if you only watched the first 5 episodes, it might be a little bit confusing, because you might be saying, okay, this guy didn't really do anything in this episode, but he's still here kind of doing his thing. This is what that feels like. I feel like you really have to read all of this series to say, okay, this all clicks as one gigantic series. The problem is, they didn't collect it as one gigantic 18-issue series or whatever. This is only 6 issues, and it reads like you're watching the first episode of a series, and then you're asked to say, okay, what's going on with the entire series? I don't know. You only showed me the first episode. You showed me 6 issues here, and I still don't really have a handle on what's going on here, and that's not a good thing. Now, maybe if I read the entire series, I might have a different opinion on it, but I'm not going to pay money for volumes 2 and 3 and however many other volumes there are of this series when I felt so lukewarm reading this one. Maybe if they had kind of switched things around a little bit, take out some of the characters in this volume that don't really do anything in this story, focus more on the characters that are doing something, and then you can expand your reach. You look at the Game of Thrones books, you start with the Stark family, and they're all in one place, and then you introduce the King and the Lannisters, and then you kind of say, okay, here's what's going to happen. These characters are going to go here, these characters are going to go here, and these characters are going to stay here. And then you can start splitting your forces and saying, okay, now that these guys are here, something else happens, and then she's going to go here, and he's going to go here. You can do that after you've introduced everybody, and you slowly get your characters into the world. You slowly get your audience familiar with this world. When you're reading Game of Thrones, you don't start off by introducing, I don't know, the Targaryens who are over here, and then this character who you're not going to see for 2 more books. You don't do that. You start off with these characters, and then you slowly branch out. That's not what's going on here. So, while this book might be good for somebody who is a huge Wildstorm fan, and I would say I was a pretty big fan of like Planetary and The Authority by Warren Ellis. I would say I was a fan of those books, but this is not doing it for me. So, would I recommend this book? Only if you are a very big fan of the Wildstorm universe, even more than I am. And if you're a big fan of Warren Ellis, who I am pretty hit or miss on. Sometimes I think he turns in really solid work, and then sometimes I can barely recognize it as the same person that I liked before. So anyway, those are my thoughts on this book. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week with another video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.